What is poppin' YouTube? Bringing you my running back tier rankings for week 16 to help you know who to start and who to sit. Starting it off here in the S tier. And there are some major changes happening this week. I'm just kidding. It's going to be CMC. He is still the 101 for me this week. Best player in fantasy football. Even though he is going up against the Baltimore Ravens, this 49ers team has a ton of good defensive players. So Christian McCaffrey, yes, we still have him as a high-end running back one. You're starting him in your playoff matchup. Number 2, we're moving to our A tier. We got Kyren Williams, Alvin Kamara, Rachaad White, James Cook, Raheem Mostert, Jahmyr Gibbs, and Joe Mixon. There's a bunch of guys in this A tier, and we are not messing around in the fantasy football playoffs. Kyren Williams is going up against the New Orleans Saints here, and it's a really great matchup for the Rams, but even more for Kyren Williams. We're projecting somewhere around 18 fantasy points. This is an A-plus matchup, and I know the New Orleans Saints defense has been good, but Kyren Williams is an absolute PPR machine. Moving on to Alvin Kamara here as the RB3 this week, going up against the Rams, and I think both these running backs are going to eat for their respective offenses in this game. Alvin Kamara, if we look at what he's been doing the last few weeks, it's been good. 16 fantasy points, 14 fantasy points, 29, 16, just a very good baseline level. But we are still waiting on just another breakout game for Alvin Kamara. I really do like Alvin Kamara here in the A tier. Rachaad White's the next guy on this list, going up against the Jacksonville Jaguars. It's an A matchup, and Rachaad White's been on an absolute heater, where the last 3 weeks he has finished as a top 10 running back, 20 fantasy points, 22 fantasy points, 22 fantasy points, and I think this continues versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. Sadly, I did not draft enough Rachaad White this year to make myself happy with this Alvin Kamara-ish production, but we do have Rachaad right here. Then we move on to James Cook, and this is the first time James Cook has entered into A tier, and it's just official. We wanted to beat around the bush enough with James Cook even last week, and a lot of you were telling me, Caleb, come on, he's the real deal. Comes out 36 fantasy points in week 1 of fantasy football. Absolutely love that. Finished as the RB2 this week. It was a great matchup versus the Dallas Cowboys, and this week going up against the Chargers. I just think they're going to get up early. And yes, James Cook has been an absolute PPR machine, but even last week, 25 rushing attempts. The thing is, we have not seen James Cook have that type of bell cow production. He has been getting the rushing attempts with the targets, but I do really like some James Cook there. So love some James Cook this week in PPR formats. Moving on to the next guy, it's going to be Raheem Mostert. As much as we'd love to see Devon step up and be that clear RB1 for the Miami Dolphins, that just hasn't happened. And Raheem Mostert with 18 fantasy points in PPR with 2 total touchdowns, that kind of saved his day. Honestly, he didn't have a great matchup versus the Jets, but this week going up against the Dallas Cowboys, and for just as much as the Jets are a great defense, so are the Dallas Cowboys. So I still like Raheem Mostert. I don't have him as a top 5 back this week. I like the overall upside that he possesses on the ground and in the touchdown game. Moving on to our RB7 here in the A tier is going to be Jahmyr Gibbs. And Jahmyr Gibbs is going up against Minnesota. The Lions are facing Minnesota. 14.2 fantasy points is kind of where I'm projecting him, but last week finished as the RB3 with 25 fantasy points with 8 total targets. The thing that made me excited about last week is he really didn't have any work out of the air. Only had 2 receptions on 2 targets, but rushed 11 times for 100 yards and 2 total touchdowns. So Jahmyr Gibbs, like we said, is pretty much a league winner. Jahmyr Gibbs is what we were hoping Bijan Robinson to be when we were drafting him in the first round. But the benefit was you drafted Jahmyr Gibbs in the 3rd round. So hopefully you are in the playoffs because of Jahmyr Gibbs and this late season production that Jahmyr Gibbs has been providing. We move on to the last guy in the A tier, and it's going to be Joe Mixon. 15 fantasy points is what he put up last week versus the Minnesota Vikings. Rushings for 47 yards, 3 receptions, 14 yards, and 1 total touchdown. But the thing is, the weeks previous to this, 22 fantasy points and 30 fantasy points. So honestly, I've been wrong about Joe Mixon. Last week I had him rated way too low, even though he just had himself an okay day, but I still think Joe Mixon has the potential to get into that 20-point threshold again this week. Now moving on to our B tier, we got Tony Pollard, Travis Etienne, Isaiah Pacheco, Mr. Bijan, Arthur Smith, H.U. Robinson, Derrick Henry, Saquon Barkley, and Breece Hall. Starting it off with Tony Pollard, and yes, Tony Pollard is playing one of the best offenses in football. But last week finished as the RB36 with only 8 fantasy points. It wasn't great, but as we had seen before this, 18 fantasy points, 22 fantasy points, 17 fantasy points, 17 fantasy points. Tony Pollard's going to be fine. He was just going up against a pretty stout Buffalo front 7. This week going up against Miami, and Miami's a little bit banged up, so I do like some Tony Pollard this week. Maybe not, like we said, in the A tier by any stretch of the imagination, but here leading off the B tier, we do like it. We move on to the next guy in this tier, and it's going to be Travis Etienne. Travis Etienne is going up against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and it's been a little bit depressing with Travis Etienne last week, with him only finishing as the RB25. So if you somehow made it into your semi-final rounds after that 10 fantasy point day production from last week, I think it should get better here against Tampa Bay. I think he probably finishes in that upper teens to maybe even gets into the 20-point threshold this week. We like some Travis Etienne here. My next guy in the rankings is going to be Isaiah Pacheco as he's going up against the Las Vegas Raiders. And Isaiah Pacheco's been injured, so we've been seeing the Clyde Edwards-Helaire show. So it'll be interesting to see what this snap share is going to be looking like with Isaiah Pacheco. But before he got injured, he's an absolute fantasy darling, so have to have him here in our B tier. Move on to our next guy, and it's Bijan Robinson. Arthur Smith clearly hates Bijan Robinson. I do not know what Bijan Robinson did to Arthur Smith. I know he fumbled this last week, but when they give Bijan Robinson the ball, good things happen. And the fact that he had literally 0 fantasy points in the fantasy football playoffs week 1 absolutely sucks. So this week going up against the Indianapolis Colts, it is a pretty good matchup for Bijan Robinson. Can he get some fantasy football production? Can he get more than 7 carries? I hope so. But this team needs to get rid of Arthur Smith ASAP, and there's going to be a video coming out about Arthur Smith and Bijan Robinson. Next guy is going to be Derrick Henry, and Derrick Henry, we absolutely loved his playoff schedule heading into the playoffs. And you know what Derrick Henry did? He was one of the first running backs ever to have 16 rushing attempts for less than 10 yards. Now, this could be because of age. It could be because of the offense. But for me, it makes me a little bit worried that we're starting to see the major decline of Derrick Henry. And I don't like it because I absolutely love Derrick Henry. But going up against Seattle and their kind of pretty weak front 7 makes me excited again. I will be rolling Derrick Henry out. If he got you here, you got to roll him back out again. Can't be scared. Can't be playing scared ball with our running back. So I do have Derrick Henry here in our B tier. Moving on to Saquon Barkley. Saquon Barkley and Tommy DeVito. It's been an interesting pairing, but it has worked out pretty well for Saquon Barkley. Now, the thing that I will mention with Saquon Barkley is just overall upside just doesn't seem to be there. This last week, only 6 fantasy points in PPR, but the week before that, 23, week before that, 6, 30. So this is my thing. He kind of has like a 15 to 30 point game. Then he drops a 7 or 6 bomb. So he dropped the 6 bomb this last week. So just basic math would imply that he's on for like a 20 point day this next week versus the Philadelphia Eagles. Now, a terrible matchup for the Giants as they have to go up against this Eagles defense. But I do like Saquon Barkley here as he's facing the Philadelphia Eagles. Next guy in this tier is going to be Breece Hall. And Breece Hall, yes, is he the only part of this offense for the Jets that can even be accounted for each and every week? That is very much so true. This last week finished as the RB61 with only 3 fantasy points. This Jets offense looked absolutely atrocious. The week before that had 27, finished as the RB2. So can he get back on track versus Washington? Can he get back on track versus Washington? We'll see it. It might just be a defensive shutout game for both of these teams. But you have to put Breece Hall here because of the volume that Breece Hall is going to possess. Moving on to our C tier, we got Zeke Elliott, Aaron Jones, David Montgomery, DeAndre Swift, Devon, Jonathan Taylor, and Chuba Hubbard. Starting this tier off with Zeke Elliott, my man's been an absolute volume play each and every week. Last week only had 10 fantasy points, but the week before that 27 to 13. We're talking about a high-end RB2 here. We love some Zeke going up against Denver. It is a very good matchup. Then we got Aaron Jones. Aaron Jones did bounce back after this injury to kind of upgrade, be in our top 18 running backs here. Last week had 11 fantasy points, finished as an RB21. They're just going to continue to get Aaron Jones more and more involved as he gets more healthy, because let's not forget, weeks 12, week 14, my man was out, so he missed 3 games. So first game back, 13 carries, 4 targets, 4 receptions. We like to see that volume. If that can increase to 15 carries and maybe he gets 6 receptions, we absolutely love it for Aaron Jones. Next guy in this tier is going to be David Montgomery. How the mighty have fallen. Jahmyr Gibbs is the clear 1A and David Montgomery is the clear 1B. And the thing is with David Montgomery, he's just not getting that same like 20 to 22 touches, and his efficiency has kind of dropped, and that overall touchdown upside just hasn't been there because Sam Laporta and this passing attack have absolutely taken over. So David Montgomery versus Minnesota, can he land into the end zone? That's what I'm banking on with my lineups with David Montgomery. Can he fall under the end zone? Next guy's gonna be DeAndre Swift, and DeAndre Swift, same exact reasons that we've been talking about David Montgomery being a touchdown or bust type upside, that's happening with DeAndre Swift. And on Monday night, let's be clear, he got tackled at the 1, so his fantasy football output of 10 fantasy points would have been 16 or 17. Talking about him in a little bit different light than RB28 this last week, but he still is getting volume. 18 carries for 74 yards, 3 targets, 2 receptions. My man just needs to find pay dirt. That's really what it comes down to with DeAndre Swift. Moving on to Devon Achane. The thing is, Devon was injured. There was a risk that he wasn't even going to play this last week, but he ended up playing. We haven't seen that elite level upside. Raheem Mostert has taken over as the 1A in this offense, and there's part of me that thinks maybe Devon gets it going here late just because they want to rest Raheem for the playoffs, but we just cannot bank on that type of production. And last week, like we said, only 9 fantasy points. The week before that, 12. So how can I really trust Devon if you have better options? I just don't think you can, but I say that and he probably is just going to blow up on us. Have an absolute fabulous day this next week. Then we got Jonathan Taylor coming back from injury. We assume he's going to be back this week. We do like the matchup for Jonathan Taylor versus Atlanta. Like we said, he's had some really good games this year. It's just a matter of, are they going to give him the touches and what that split backfield is going to look like with the thumb, since they are still kind of fighting for a playoff spot. Then rounding out that C tier, we got Chuba Hubbard for the Carolina Panthers versus Green Bay. Chuba put up 12 fantasy points. The week before that, 12. The week before that, 22. The week before that, 20. So he's finished anywhere between like the RB6 to RB25 range. And that's where I'm expecting him to kind of fit in this week, probably in that RB18 to RB22 range. I do like Chuba Hubbard. It's a good matchup versus Green Bay. but this offense has not been living up to its potential with Bryce Young. Now moving on into our D tier, we got Kenneth Walker, we have James Conner, we have Austin Eckler, we have Javonte Williams, we have Josh Jacobs, and we have Ty Chandler. Starting this off with Kenneth Walker. You saw Kenneth Walker, he's starting to get back to being healthy. We got to see a little bit of explosion, finishing as the RB8 this last week versus Philadelphia. This week going up against Tennessee. And what are these splits going to look like? Because if he gets 19 carries and he can get somewhere around 100 yards, you're going to tell me, Caleb, he is definitely a little bit low. Maybe I should push him higher, but I just right here, RB23 felt pretty fair for me with Kenneth Walker. Next guy in this tier is going to be James Conner, who just got off a day, having a very good day versus the 49ers. When we're looking at James Conner, this is the thing. Finished as the RB11, 18 fantasy points. So you're saying to me, Caleb, if he can start to get the volume, which is what you preach, because I love James Conner coming into the season, why are you lower on him? Really, there's just some options that I like more that have more boom potential above James Conner, but we still have James Conner here in the D tier. Moving on to my next guy, it's going to be Austin Eckler. Mr. Underperforming, Mr. I don't know what to do, Austin Eckler. It's bad. Finished as the RB35 last week with 8 fantasy points. I hear you. 5 rushes for 9 total yards, 6 targets for 4 receptions, 29 yards. I mean, 8 fantasy points. You probably lost last week if you had Austin Eckler, so maybe I shouldn't have even ranked him. Still got to rank him here because I think he does have upside. Next guy in the tier is going to be Javonte Williams, and Javonte Williams is going up against New England. It's a good matchup. We do like some Javonte Williams going up against New England. Like we said, last week finished with only 4 fantasy points for 51 yards. It wasn't great for Javonte, but we are re-rolling with Javonte this week. We move on to Josh Jacobs versus Kansas City. I mean, goodness gracious. Since week 12, he was a top 5 running back, but then he had the bye. Then last week finished as the RB42 with only 7 fantasy points, but it hasn't been great for Josh Jacobs. I'm not going to lie. This might be a ranking based on name value more than anything else with Josh Jacobs, but we do have Josh Jacobs here. Next guy in this tier is going to be Devin Singletary for Houston versus Cleveland. We do like Devin Singletary. We like what this Houston Texans team has been doing. And last week we saw what they could do with Case Keenum, but just imagine this week with CJ Stroud and Nico Collins back. Finished as the RB7 with 21 fantasy points. Can you get in that 15 to 20 fantasy point range as your RB3, as your flex play? I absolutely love that for Devin Singletary. And rounding out our running backs, we will be going with Jerome Ford going up against Houston. And yes, this last week only 7 fantasy points. It wasn't great. But the thing that I continue to like to see with Jerome Ford is that explosion. And he's still getting targets. He got 5 targets for 4 receptions this last week, but only for 11 yards, 8 total carries. If he can end up with more than 10 or 11 carries, I really like Jerome Ford here as a top 30 running back. So I appreciate you guys so much tuning into this video. Tomorrow we will be talking about some dynasty stashes. So if you like dynasty content, we'll be talking about that, some waiver wires to target. We're also going to be doing a dynasty mock draft here later this week. So once you guys hear, we're going to be providing the redraft content for you still, but the dynasty content will start to ramp up as the season is coming to a close. So I appreciate you guys so much for all the support you gave me this year. We're going to continue to grind. I'll catch you on the next one. Peace.